Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Andrew Culp, professor of media theory and history at the California Institute of the Arts and in the master's program in aesthetics and politics. First, I want to thank the city of West Hollywood this evening for helping host this series. I'd like also to thank School of Critical Studies at CalArts, as well as the MA in Aesthetics and Politics, who've helped make the whole series possible, as well as tonight's event. I would like to ask everyone to take a moment, if you'd like, to look at our recent blog post on our platform Open Assembly by one of our students, Ali, in which the title is How to Avoid Kettling, Line Dance as Protest. It uses the work of Calvin Warren, our guest tonight, in order to theorize essential moments in today's theorist, art, but also politics going on in contemporary America. Also, I'd like to thank you as the audience for being here, taking the time out of this Friday evening to join us. Let me first begin by saying this is part of a long series that's been going on for nearly a decade called WHAP, West Hollywood Aesthetics and Politics. It's a program that joins the city of West Hollywood with the MA Aesthetics Politics program at CalArts to interrogate a whole series of issues, anywhere from design to philosophy, like we're having tonight, hopefully with things that are exciting and are important issues that are with much at stake. And as part of the semester-long series, the theme has been Blackout. It's convened by me, and it was prompted by Simone Brown's writing, a media theorist, in which she thinks for the targets of surveillance, perhaps the goal of increased visibility is not always a virtuous good. And instead, Brown instigates us to look for, quote, fugitive acts of escape, resistance, and productive disruptions that happen when Blackness enters the frame. And that comes from her amazing monumental book, Dark Matters. A few notes on the format. First, in terms of presentation order, we're going to be joined by Professor Warren of Emory, who's going to give about a 45 to 60-minute talk. And then there's going to be a response by Linette Park of Penn State. There's also then going to be an opportunity for question and answers at the end, as well as an ongoing dialogue with both of our speakers. Note there may be a short delay between when you enter your remarks within the chat and the ability for the speakers to respond to it, but I'm sure it's not going to create any problems. So for tonight, let me introduce our program. And we're incredibly excited to have the talk Being Blacked Out, Blacking Out Being Nihilistic Considerations, as well as the response by Linette Park. Our speaker is Calvin Warren, an associate professor of African American Studies at Emory University. Warren's research interests are in Continental Philosophy, particularly post-Heideggerian and nihilistic philosophy, Lacanian psychoanalysis, queer theory, Afro-pessimism, and theology. Duke University Press published his first book, Ontological Terror, Blackness, Nihilism, and Emancipation in 2018. He's currently working on a second project, Onticide, Essays on Black Nihilism and Sexuality, which unravels the metaphysical foundations of Black sexuality and argues for a rethinking of sexuality without the human, sexual difference, or coherent bodies. And second, our respondent is Linette Park, who's a postdoctoral fellow African American Studies Department at Pennsylvania State University. Prior to joining Penn State, she was the Thurgood Marshall Fellow of African American Studies program at Dartmouth College. She received her PhD in the Culture and Theory program from the University of California at Irvine, and holds an MA from Aesthetics and Politics program right here at CalArts. She's a fellow at the Psychoanalytic Center in Philadelphia, member of the Emerging Scholars in Theology Network, and an editor of the special issue of Black Resistance that is forthcoming with the journal Diacritics, a review of contemporary criticism. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished and incredibly thoughtful guests tonight.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that wonderful introduction. And it's a great honor to be here. Earlier, we had a seminar and it raised so many provocative and generative ideas. So I'm still feasting on them. I really want to thank you all and your students for that. So today what I want to do is just to present a blush of a thought. It's an idea that I had percolating in my head, so it is unfinished, but I do want to present some of these remarks just for thought and and to get us thinking about surveillance in a different way. What I'd like to do today is to think of the Karen call as a particular form of surveillance. A surveillance that is not only a surveillance of Black bodies in physical space, but surveillance as ontological surveillance. And I know very often when we think of surveillance, we don't often think of being as being surveilled or surveilling being, but I think that the Karen call might invite us to rethink the multi-dimensional aspects of surveillance. So what I like to do first is just to show a video to get us started. Let's see here.
I'm being threatened by a man in the ramble. Please send the cops immediately. Please stop. Sir, I'm asking you to stop.
Please don't come close to me.
Sir, I'm asking you to stop recording me.
Please don't come close to me.
Please take your phone off.
Please don't come close to
And
me.
I'm taking pictures calling the cops.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
Excuse me? I'm sorry, I'm in the ramble, and there is a man, African-American, he has a bicycle helmet. He is recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African-American man, I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog. And my I'm sorry, I can't hear a breather. I'm being threatened by a man in the ramble. Please send the cops immediately. I'm in Central Park in the ramble. I don't know.
Thank you.
Okay. So, Shaman Walter, supervisor for District 10 of San Francisco, introduced the Karen Act. And this act was to discourage the routinized and fraudulent calls that fabricate danger and Black dread. And he says, quote, racist 911 calls are unacceptable. That's why I'm introducing the Karen Act. This is the Karen that we need. Caution against racially exploitative non-emergencies, end quote. But what if this non-emergency is a misrecognized emergency in the order of being? Can we recast the call as a surveillance that an anti-Black world requires rather than an unnecessary exploitation? Further, can we think of the Karen call as an anti-Black aesthetic practice, one that requires inexhaustible energy and charged affect? Does the recurrence of this call require another analysis, one that can account for the telephonic surveillance as an ontological artwork? Judith Butler provides another instance of a call in The Psychic Life of Power, where she talks about a paradoxical or tautological constitution of the subject, a call that produces a subject but cannot account for what exactly turns or heeds the call prior to the call, a body that is constituted through the turn itself and is subjected to power through that turn. Butler's Althusserian reading exposes the subject as a tautological performance, both constituted and subjugated. A guilty conscience then provides the apparatus of this paradox. The call that I have in mind, however, marks another scene, one that Butler does not remark on, a scene in which this performative subject, this turning body, places a call not only to affirm the tenuous condition of its subjectivity, but as a surveillance of its boundaries. A call is placed when an object attempts to perform subjectivity, or an object is quote unquote out of place. This call then, this call into police power as a form of calling into being is designed to regulate the ontological boundaries of this performative subject, to ensure these boundaries are not contaminated by an encroaching other. And in this instance, we can see an encroaching Black other that has the audacity to perform subjectivity where there should be one, where there should be an interdiction on subjectivity. The call place watches over the field of being and registers what we might call a compromise of this field's integrity. Black life or any defiance against a mandate or expectation of social death is experienced as ontological violation. So what I want to argue is that this call, what catalyzes this call, is that when Black life assumes any activity that would defy the place of social death or the expectation of the dead subject that the field requires. So any, diurnal activity, walking, jogging, eating barbecue, sitting in a Starbucks, waiting outside an apartment building, shopping in a Walgreens, sleeping in a dorm, anything that we would think as ordinary activity within the field of life, all of these things are recast as threatening for a Karen or for the Karen call. And so what I want to think about is the way that these ordinary diurnal activities are both recast as threatening and need to be confronted with extreme violence as a way of shoring up the ontological boundaries of this performative subject, this subject that responds to interpellation. So what we can say then is that these considered threats to ontological integrity, a call is placed because of it. And this call is not to interpolate the Black into a subject, but to use extreme force to keep Blacks in a place of execration or ontological obliteration. The Karen call then, although considered ignorant or unenlightened use of police power, or as the council person said, racial exploitation. Although it's considered these things, I want to think about the Karen call as indispensable because it performs ontological labor. Let's call this ontological labor anti-Black vigilance. Each call placed, each cell phone used, calls into being and awaits a response. This ritualized calling, this sonic performance, concretizes the arid space in which Blacks, following Frantz Fanon, are suspended both spatially and temporally for Black objects, and subjects them to a particular judgment or expectation of brutal violence. The Karen call then is both threat and art, performance and critique of racial judgment. The call is an aesthetic practice of both anti-Black enjoyment and purported moral obligation. I, however, want to think through the ontological work that the call performs, or thinking with Jean-Luc Nancy when he says that ontology is a phonology. Ontology is a phonology. And ontology is sustained or experienced through and as the call. Ontological constitution and ontological execration are both mediated through the call. And in the 21st century, the cell phone is the indispensable technology of ontology. Again, for me in the 21st century, the cell phone is the indispensable technology of ontology. Also, we might think of it this way, that the Karen call is a particular genre. It's a performative aesthetic or an art. And what I mean by that is that the Karen call has to figure urgency, danger, and distress within a convincing performance, a performance in which the receiver believes that ontological violation has occurred and that her person has been threatened. The caller must raise the mundane or the everyday activity to the position of extreme threat. So again, part of the aesthetic performance or part of the art of the Karen call is that the caller must raise the mundane to the position of extremity, to the position of extreme threat. So, if you recall the opening video, the caller increases intensity, right? And clearly nothing is happening to her that we can see. You know, whatever threatening Black man is within her field of vision is far removed from her and pleading for her not to touch him. But be that as it may, what is happening is that the performance requires her to increase the intensity of her voice as a form of convincing performance. So there must be something sonically that the Karen is doing in order to marshal extreme brutality, and also as a way of convincing the receiver that an ontological violation has occurred. And all of this drama is taking place over a cell phone. So the cell phone is a particular technology that is able to black out being and is able to understand or figure being as blacked out. So the telephone in the hand of the Karen is an aesthetic accomplishment of anti-Black violence. As a consummate performer, the caller must convincingly marshal police power to maintain what Foucault might call the order of things. In short, the call is what we might call ontological guardianship after Heidegger, and anti-Black vigilance. So surveillance, its definition, we know it means to watch over, to supervise, or to oversee. We might say then, given what we've said thus far, that the Karen call uses sound to oversee. The Karen call uses sound to oversee. The Karen call then is an ontological blending of the senses in order to create a heightened sense of urgency and danger. The cell phone transforms communication into a weapon of surveillance and in internecine enactment of self-deputized responsibility, which is also to say that part of the guardianship of the Karen is that the Karen is self-deputized to oversee this field of being and to call into being when there is any encroachment. So if it seems as though the calling of Karen on a Black person when they are walking, when they're eating, when they're talking, when they are barbecuing, such mundane things that seem inconsequential, these inconsequential things are absolutely consequential for a guardian that must constantly surveil the field of being against any encroachment of Black life. So it is Black life that is an interdiction, right? And the cell phone is the weapon that the Karen uses to make sure that that interdiction is obeyed. So I'd like to rethink the Karen call again as ontological labor, or as a guardian of being, policing its boundaries and marshaling violence to prevent the encroachment of Blackness. In other words, I'd like to think of the call as ontological surveillance and the cell phone as an indispensable technology of the surveillance. Heidegger would suggest in his critique of technology that we have mistaken its essence and framing. Could we then say that the Karen call brings us to the anti-Black essence of technology? Again, could we then say that the Karen call brings us to the anti-Black essence of technology, an essence that really is a calling into being? Has Heidegger already prepared us for the Karen call and what is in his writing, Being in Time and What is Thinking? Woman has a particular place within the ontophonological drama. Perhaps we can rename this call as anti-Black vigilance, where vigilance holds a certain privileged place for Heidegger's thinking about being's call and the care with which Dasein must respond. Karen then, along a Heideggerian vein, is a certain shepherd, in an act of shepherding the boundaries of being. This is why Karen places calls with such urgency and self-righteousness. The call is a responsibility, one Heidegger understands through the role of what we might call the mother or the feminine. And so we can turn to Avital's wonderful book that she provides a philosophical commentary on this in the telephone book. And she thinks through the synecdoche relation between Heidegger and the telephone as, quote, a never coinciding with what they are made to communicate, and Heidegger's answer to a perverse call of National Socialism and its technocratic abuse of the telephone and other technology. What interests me in this text, although much could be said about this canonical text, is her discussion of the mother and the relation between the mother's call and the work of Heidegger. And in What is Thinking, Heidegger remarks that a mother calls to a boy who won't come home, somewhat of a kind of a prodigal son that needs a certain calling. And Avatar remarks that the mother will, quote, will have prepared the son fully to the exfoliated of his invaginated ear, the most open of his organs. It is the mother's function to incite a sonic desire through her parenting. She teaches the child how to desire hearing in a Lacanian vein. She also stages the coordinates of this sonic fantasy in which hearing organizes the possibilities of existence and the relation between being that is a necessary relation for survival within a metaphysical world. And she also says that before receding like the feminine voice of an operator when a connection has been made, she, the mother, will have transformed her boy into an automatic listening device. For Avital, the mother incites desire and prepares the boy to be attentive to the call of being, to listen to desire. But I'd like to also suggest that the mother's work is not just done there. For the mother not only prepares the male to listen, but the mother also guards being through calls as well, by placing calls. The function of surveillance as an act of preservation of being, then I said, will be another function of the feminine in Heidegger that we might think through as the particular function of the Karen call. So what I want to argue here is that I think for Avital, her brilliant reading of the mother and her relation to the call and Heidegger is that it is the mother's function to prepare the listening ear for the boy, right, for the male child and all of its phallocentrism. And it's the mother's preparation that allows the child to be prepared for being's unfolding or to be prepared for the call of being. But what I want to argue is that what the Karen call also tells us is that the mother's function, or we can say the function of the feminine within the ontological drama of the call, is also to constantly place calls into being, to make sure that the field of being is unencroached by that which would contaminate it. So I would say that the feminine place within this ontological drama, this ontophonology, is that she not only prepares the boy, but she also assists the boy in guardian being. So when the Karen threatens with, I am going to call the police, we might say, if we read that through a Heideggerian veil, that the I am going to call the police is that I am going to call the boy that I've prepared to listen to being's calling and to make sure that that boy uses violence as an aspect of care, as an aspect of his guardianship and shepherding of being. And this is why I think we cannot just dismiss the Karen call as just unenlightened racial exploitation of police power. The fact that it keeps continuing, the fact that it is persistent, I think requires an ontological explanation. One that, again, I said, is just a blush of a thought here, but one that I think that we can think through as a particular form of shepherding. So in turning to shepherding, as we all know, Heidegger talks about the shepherding of being, or the destiny of man as existence, as guardian of being. And he discusses some of this in the letter on humanism. And in it, he says that the human being as existing has to guard the truth of being. So one of the aspects of Dasein, or the human, is that in his or her existing, it is important to guard the truth of being. So what does it mean to guard? I started thinking about, when I received this invitation for surveillance, I started to think about what does it mean to be an ontological guardian of being? And how does surveillance come into play within this drama or this function or role of guardianship. Now, Heidegger kind of remarks on some of this, and he clarifies, he says, quote, since being is never the merely precisely actual, to guard being can never be equated with the task of a guard who protects from burglars as a treasure stored in a building. Guardianship of being is not filtrated upon something existing. The existing thing taken for itself never contains an appeal of being. Guardianship is vigilance, watchfulness for the has-been and coming destiny of being, a vigilance that issues from a long and ever renewed thoughtful deliberateness, which heeds the directive that lives in the manner in which being marks its appeal. So we can think of this particular guardianship as a vigilance and a watchfulness over the unfolding, or let's, for lack of a better term, say the field of being. So guardianship, as I've discussed it here, we can suggest as ontological surveillance, and it is a surveillance that heeds the call of being, and it repeats and renews and cultivates this vigilance as watchfulness or a particular conscience, an anti-Black vigilance that watches over the destiny of being, or thinking about Blackness as a certain danger to being or the obstruction of what must be watched over. Ontological surveillance requires the cultivating practice and investment in vigilance. So all of this is just to say that one of the things we can think about with the Karen call as a form of surveillance is that the Karen call is a vigilance. It is the unceasing, ubiquitous, incessant watching over being. So, you know, there's a kind of a joke that the Karen appears when she is least needed, right? So the Karen appears when you are walking a dog or when you are carrying your groceries. So in those moments where it is just the most boring and mundane, the Karen appears. But I think we dismiss the particular vigilance of the Karen's emergence as a watchfulness that Black existence does not encroach within the field of being, that Black existence stays within the errant space that I called the execration of being. So the ontological labor that the Karen performs through these calls is constantly to watch over these things. Now, we can understand vigilance, its definition, of course, as a watching, a keeping awake. Then Blackness then is a feared somnambulism. It is the Blackness then in relation to vigilance is a walking dead or social death as slumber or anti-Black vigilance that must be guarded against as one watches out for being's unfolding and its incessant withdrawal. And I thought that it was really interesting. I want to just share very quickly another video where even in sleep, the Karen perceives a danger. So when the Black, I will say object, but when the Black is sleeping, it is a vigilance that must be marshaled in order to regulate the field of being, so that even sleep is recast as ontological danger. And even Black sleep or Black rest requires extreme police force in order to watch over it. So I think many of you are familiar with this case, but I'll show it just in case some of you aren't, just for, you know, just kind of thought.
A Black graduate student after she fell asleep in a common room of her dorm, and then the police were called. Here's ABC's Lindsay Davis.
Growing frustration tonight after yet another instance of police being called to investigate a Black person carrying out a routine act. The latest target was taking a nap.
I have every right to call the police. You cannot sleep in that room.
This white student called police on a Black graduate student who fell asleep while writing a paper in the dorm's common area.
I was sleeping on the couch.
Okay. and said, you're not supposed to be here. Why are you sleeping here?
4 officers respond.
Once we verify that you're a resident here, we'll be on our way.
Cianbola unlocks her door to prove she lives there, but police still want to see ID. She turns it over, but is detained 15 minutes when the name doesn't exactly match their records.
I deserve to be here. I pay tuition like everybody else. I'm not going to justify my existence here.
Cianbola tells police the same woman called police on her friend, a fellow student, in March. That student says when he asked for directions, she responded,
"You're making me uncomfortable. I don't feel safe around you. You're an intruder. You need to get out. You need to leave."
In response to this week's incident, Yale released a statement saying Yale police followed procedures and added that police admonished the student who made the call. The vice president for Student Life issued a statement saying she is deeply troubled by this incident and that they now plan to hold listening sessions. She went on to say, "We still have so much more to do." David.
Lindsay, thank you.
So, you know, the grammar of "you are an intruder, you need to get out," I think can be read just not as an intruder into physical space, but it is that physical space becomes a way of articulating an ontological encroachment. You do not belong in this space because you belong in an arid space of execration. Yale University, I guess, is not one of them, right? So you, even in sleep, even in rest, the Black presence is still considered to be a danger, a threat that requires a calling in to police power as a calling into being, and to judge Black presence and Black existing as both pathological and out of order, right? Out of place, right? So Black presence does not belong. So surveillance as an anti-Black vigilance requires technological apparatuses. If the essence of technology is something more than usually thought of as technology, as Heidegger would tell us, then we know that technology is an indispensable tool to perform this vigilance. To consider the telephone and its call as a necessary vigilance requires a bit of thinking about the call that we ourselves have neither planned nor prepared for a voluntary performance, nor have we ever done so. It calls against our expectations and against our will, as Heidegger would say. But what I would suggest is that although for Heidegger, he might focus on the call of being, I want to say that there is maybe a dialectical process in which Dasein calls into being in multiple ways. And one way that Dasein would call into being, I would say, is the use of technology as a way of judging what does not belong or what might be non-ontological. So the calling into being is not the end of the story. There is, the call of being is not the end of the story. There is also a mutual calling into being. And perhaps these things constitute mutual processes that sustain an anti-Black world. The last thing that I'll say, some of this, the place of the feminine and the work of vigilance is taking up in the Letter of Humanism, where Heidegger would say, man is not the Lord of existence. He wins the essential poverty of the shepherd, whose worth consists in being called by being itself. This call comes as the throwing from which the thrownness of existence stems. I want to turn our attention, given this thrownness into existence, to Sylvia Wynter, who, much like Heidegger, writes a letter to her colleagues. And in this letter, it's one that perhaps articulates an anti-Black vigilance or conscience that is manifested through particular calls to police. Wynter does not take Dasein for granted like Heidegger, but questions the place or its particular activity and boundaries. And she focuses on the inner eye, or how one is seeing, or how one is seen, or this double consciousness that determines the visual field and the violence of this field. And she centers her letter to her colleagues around the phrase, no human involved. So, the LAPD has this code that she provides a very wonderful philosophical reading of. And when there is a call placed and the victim is Black, the response from a call in is that there is no human involved. There is no ontological crisis. So when the Black body is imperiled, there is no need for police presence because there is no being that is worth saving. When there is a call placed that the Black threatens Dasein or threatens the human proper, then we have the marshaling of police power. So Sylvia Wynter wants to understand what it means that there is no human involved. What are the metaphysical or our ontological consequences of this police powers grammar that there is no human involved? And she says, quote, "What have we had to do and still have to do with the putting in the place of the classifying logic of that shared more of a subjective understanding in whose inner eyes young Black males, and I'll also add young Black women, can be perceived as justly shut out from what has been called the universe of moral obligation," end quote. So part of what she wants to argue is how has the designation, when a call is placed in and the response is that there is no human involved, how do we understand that as being shut out as the universe of moral obligation? And such moral obligation we might call after Heidegger a certain consciousness or a moral vigilance. The eyes are the privileged organ in such consciousness, and it indicates that anti-Blackness impacts all the senses in a way that escape is impossible. Sight is but one portal into the moral universe, or as she will also remark, that those situated outside the quote, the universe of obligation, an obligation that is what Mills might call a racial contract, or a certain consolidation of moral consciousness that is used to sustain particular vigilance. The designation then no human involved in NHI, quote, refuses any case involving a breach of the rights of the young Black males and women who violate or who are considered to be jobless, a category of these inner city ghettos, end quote. This designation sustained by police perform ontological labor. It distinguishes between Dasein, those who are worthy of protection, and the equipment, the non-ontological, for whom violence and worthiness are thrown out of this moral universe. And it is a violence that escapes the logic of cause and effect, or what Afro-pessimists might call gratuitous. This designation of police power relies on the call or Karen calls to reinforce this ontological labor. This Karen call serves as an opening for violence, one that is considered with vigilance, a vigilance necessary to protect being from intrusion and contamination. So to bring a close to these remarks, what I am suggesting through Heidegger, through Avital, and through Wynter is that we rethink the call in the 21st century as the ontological labor and work of Dasein's violence. And rather than just focusing, as we have in philosophy, on the way that being calls Dasein, I think the Karen call invites us to think of the way that Dasein calls into being and what it expects of being and the particular violence that it expects to be a response to the encroachment. So rather than thinking of Karen, as I said, an uneducated or ignorant comical figure, one that is just a ball of anxiety, we can think of the Karen as a particular rewriting of Heidegger in the 21st century, that the Karen provides the essential ontological work of not only policing boundaries, but ensuring that the boy, right, as Heidegger would say, that she has trained to hear being's call, remains open to the possibility of using violence to protect that call as well. So I look forward to your questions and thank you for your time here.
Okay, thanks so much, Calvin. That was very generative, and so much so I think that any preparation I had in anticipation for your talk today has been kind of productively disrupted, and I mean, in the best way possible. But that's just a way to say that I'm gathering my thoughts a little bit. But I think where you end your presentation on that, on the notion of Winter's conceptualization of the inner eye is maybe a good way to start the conversation. And in a way, I'm reminded the way in which Lacan also conceptualizes the eye as a kind of mirror. And so I think by placing Winter alongside Ronell and Heidegger, you do this really eloquent job in showing the kind of scales of economy of this kind of vigilant labor. And because I'm entering your talk just through my own background in the history and afterlife of lynching, I know that this is going to color the way in which I enter the conversation. But I was thinking about how the way the Karen call, through the use or the weaponization of the cell phone, really operates as the kind of explosion of Black life into spaces outside of normalized juridical practice. So it's instrumentalized as a kind of extra legal practice, spaces of the racist imagination of this kind of inner eye that imagines Blackness as a kind of threat or as a execration, as you say. And of course, I think what your presentation highlights is how this mirrors actually the state's use of anti-Black paramilitary police forces. So that was very generative for me in that sense. But I was also, I think, and then it also, I think, sheds lights on the way in which the Karen call has this multiple ramification of carcerality as well. And so I think for me, in a way, this all kind of circulates on a question of aesthetics. Again, how you're conceptualizing the policing of the ordinariness of Black life is critical because one, it magnifies the cruel irony or perhaps even perversion in which the call is a mode of anti-Black surveillance, and how that holds the possibility to enter the genre of performance. But I think one can also say art more generally as a staging of Black death, wittingly or unwittingly. And either way, I think you're importantly flagging how this violation of the staging, in this sense, it's that implication of the call is never consensual, right? And so the violation in that sense is multiple. So secondly, I think the way in which you're raising that particularity of the moment of interpolation following Fanon, but also Butler's corrective of Althusser is very useful because it's, again, at the level of being that cannot be reconciled. I'm just pausing because I think when one uses the metaphor of call or hearing, I think in, there's this tendency to think of also a juridical hearing or a kind of juridical attunement. And I think your work in a very productive way troubles that, right? It's really calling into question the possibility of a kind of, shifting towards a more juridical attunement or the possibility of a judicious hearing. And so, in a roundabout way, that's why I say your presentation has kind of productively helped me place pressure on the status of aesthetics, because I think when we think about aesthetics, it usually operates in the orders of, or the binaries of visibility, invisibility, what's heard or what's unheard, thinkable or unthinkable. But I think, and I think, again, following Fanon, you're doing a very eloquent job in kind of placing pressure on aesthetics as both a form and a structure. And so my question to you would be, I guess in that regard, how are you thinking about aesthetics as a form or versus a kind of structure? that might be undercut by anti-Blackness. Should I keep going, or would you want to just?
Okay, no, I was just chewing on, what the pabulum, food for thought, and I think you're absolutely right. How does aesthetics is undercut by anti-Blackness? I think you're right there, and I think I also want to think about aesthetics as an indispensable tool of anti-Blackness. Very often we think of aesthetics as just an open and fruitful space of possibility and agency and recreation, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'd want to think about the decreative, to borrow Agamben's term, or the destructive force of aesthetics, the way in which an aesthetic practice is cultivated for the sheer purpose of destroying Blackness, destroying Black existence, bringing it to a precipice that violence constantly is coordinating. And this is why I think the Karen calls are cultivated performances. This is why I think of it as a kind of perverse art. You learn how to place a Karen call, in a way that you learn how to sing opera. You learn how, I used to sing in another life, and you learn how to place the voice, in what they call the mask. You learn how to keep the voice there. It's a cultivated type of vocal practice. I think of the Karen call as a cultivated anti-Black practice that we might say is a particular accomplishment that you learn how to do. You learn how to pitch the voice just so that the caller perceives imminent danger, and urgent request, right? You learn how to narrate the scene such that you place the dangerous Black body in a way that encroaches. So I called it a genre, and I'm kind of out of my depth with aesthetics, but I call it a genre because I think it is a particular aesthetic that is practiced, is learned, is shared, even if it's an unacknowledged or an unspoken education. It's a performance that, anyone can pick up, any Karen can pick up, any Karen can use at any time for any purpose. So I think that gets out of the boundaries of your question, but I want to say that I think you're absolutely right to bring in that relation. And one thing that we can think of is, are there calls that Blackness can rely on in order to endure such violence? Does the Black cell phone recording of such violence constitute not what I would call agency, but constitutes some type of Black aesthetic that, if not just documenting, provides some type of condition of possibility to endure the violence? I don't know if that's possible or not, but that's what your thinking gets me to think of.
Yeah, no, I think that was very useful, and I appreciate the way in which you approached my question, because I think as you were speaking, I was also thinking how, aesthetics alongside performance, or really, I think any genre of art, is often presented ostensibly as a kind of colorblind horizon. And so as you're saying, and again, thinking through the kind of scales which you've presented us with, from at the very level of the inner eye to the way in which it's trained and cultivated, and then, in a kind of more general sense at the level of cultural production or the state, I think it's interesting to think about how these expressions, whether as aesthetic or a kind of one's right, is ostensibly or can be interpreted as a kind of under the rubrics of like color blindness. And so, I mean, even in the video you showed us, even though she says, I can't remember exactly how she said, but she, you know, as soon as she calls 911, she says, there's an African-American man threatening me. And so even though you are thinking of it as a performance, she kind of wears her unconscious on her sleeve. So there's elements of it as well that are, might occupy at the level of non-performance too. But this all just to say that I think it can also be marshaled at the level of her own sovereignty too. And that's what also your discussion on ontological guardianship led me to, which mirrors the lynch, you know, the history of lynch mobs' use of extrajudicial violence as a mode of popular sovereignty or community justice, that they were looking out for the community, particularly in the instantiations of white womanhood. And then in another way, your presentation also made me think, so your presentation also made me think about the Karen call and this kind of longer history of aesthetics when we're thinking about the anti-Blackness of technologies, but also conversely, the technologies of anti-Blackness that are part and parcel with the spectacles of lynching. And one that came straight to my mind is the lynching of Emmett Till, especially because of the impossibility of documenting the scene in which the alleged whistle by Till was made at Carolyn Bryant. And then of course, Carolyn Bryant also half a century later in 2008 admits her lying and fabricating that Till had actually ever whistled at her. So the kind of foreclosure of that, but also the way in which, you know, her call had this kind of valence of an echo or resonates throughout. But I was thinking about this, I mean, because your work, I think, productively contributes to Black feminist scholarship on the discussion of Till and the use of representation. One that comes into mind particularly is the work of Jacqueline Goldsby, who places this alongside her reading of the judicial hearing between Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas, who of course notoriously described the hearing as a high-tech lynching. And so for me, I think your work is also not only adding to this, but adding to the valence in which scholars such as Goldsby, but also Jared Sexton have raised this question: when do lynching and policing begin and when does it end? And I think the call, not just even at the moment of the event that takes place, but in its kind of contingent echo, you know, magnifies this question. And so I guess I wanted to ask you if you can say more about how you're thinking, how you're thinking Blackness and sexuality together to problematize the call as an anti-Black genre and performance. But I think because you just so clearly show how it works as a kind of libidinal technology and the disaggregation of Black life. So again, anti-Blackness and technology, or maybe the anti-Blackness of technology and the technologies of anti-Blackness, structuring violent multiple realities as ordinary and the policing of that.
Yeah, I think those are really, that's profound insight. And there was an aspect of it that I didn't have an opportunity to really develop in these remarks, but I wanted to think about the pleasure of placing the call. That there is a certain libidinal investment in the call itself, that the call is sexual in and of itself. And it reminds me of Lucy Irigary's text in The Forgetting of Air, where she wants to think about the sexual destiny of being. And that, it is the mother's body, it is the feminine that provides the condition of possibility for the unfolding of being. It's her fluids, it's her, body that has been forgotten by the male, that needs to be remembered if we're going to remember being. And thinking alongside of Irigare in that way, I would think about the sexual destiny of being and the anti-Black investment in that destiny, and how the call is a particular technology of that libidinal investment. So placing a call is not just a kind of a legal operation, but it is also a highly erotically charged encounter. And I say that because it does make me think about the lynching scene, because we can't think about lynching as just extra legal violence. It is also very erotic. The cutting off of penises, the forced fellatio, the cutting off of breasts, all of these sexual practices that are really integral to the scene of anti-Black violence and its brutality. So all of that is to say that sexuality and the call, I think, are mutually constitutive and imbricated in such a messy way that it's hard to disentangle them. So in reading that scene of Karen calling the police on the man in the park, it's hard not to wonder whether there is an erotic charge there, right? It's hard not to wonder, what does an anti-Black libidinal economy allow within this scene? Is it required for a heteronormative order that white femininity place this call, right? Is there something about white femininity in its placing of a call in relation to a Black male body that, as you said, really exposes the way that the libidinal economy of anti-Blackness mobilizes itself in various ways? So I'm meandering on your brilliant comment, but I think like lynching is so enmeshed in libidinal and erotic violence, I think the call, that Karen call, is also a violence that's enmeshed in libidinal and erotic violence as well. Parsing out the eroticism of that call is something that I haven't been able to do, but I think that it is certainly an area of research and an area of discussion that might explain why Karens keep calling, right? It is something perhaps that is another incentive, aside from just policing the boundaries of ontology, that there's also a libidinal investment or payoff as well.
No, that's really useful. And actually, I like your use. I appreciate your use of Ronell's work as well in that scene with the mother and the child, because, oh dear, my notes are scattered everywhere. But the way that I think there's that, I think that scene of the mother and the son is really salient because the importance of that relationship of holding. And so obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but the attachment between the mother and child is instrumental in formulating one sense of relation with others, but also in one's sense of impingement into the environment. And so I think the way in which you're showing how, a la Ronell, how, the child internalizes a racial difference or especially, is really internalizing anti-Blackness from one's earliest developments. I think that is quite salient, but also, yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say, not in just like the cultivation of an anticipation of performing and policing one's boundaries as becoming a kind of guardian, but also in the articulation in perceiving one's sense of environment. So that was really interesting. I also was thinking about the Karens that make the kind of sovereign judgment to police one's boundaries, but also the Karens who don't know any boundaries, as you say, and so they're like two sides of the same coin. So for example, like maybe the Karen who's invited to one barbecue and suddenly she thinks she's invited to all of the barbecues. And so that also, inserts herself as a kind of, naturalizes the positionality in which white women are policing the ordinariness of Black life. In a kind of roundabout way, that doesn't really lead to my next question at all, but I wanted to ask you, and you touched upon this a little bit earlier, when you're talking about Irigaray, I wanted to ask you how you're thinking about Black nihilism in this notion, I guess in the context of the call as a kind of aesthetic form, but also as a genre of performance, but maybe more generally in art. And I ask this because on one hand, through a kind of theological interpretation, but also maybe through a kind of psychoanalytic lens, the task in the work of art is, there's this notion in which the task of the work of art is always to spring forth something to, and in that sense, maybe the call works in a kind of different register. But it's often contextualized in the act of creation, but a creation as a consequence of a decision. And that decision is an annihilation of choice. And here I'm specifically thinking through the work of Walter Benjamin. And Benjamin, categorizes choice at the level of natural life, but the decision for him is something that's transcendent. So my question to you is, how do you interpret Black nihilism and the metaphysical foundations of Black sexuality in or against this in the work of art, or maybe in the just simply in the context of creation or creating? I guess in that sense too, I was thinking, you did a really, your talk is very generative for me in the sense that the way in which you're conceptualizing the Karen call as an ontological technology, as a kind of techne, is very revealing. But then how might you distinguish that from the possibility or impossibility of a kind of poiesis or metapoiesis?
Mm-hmm. Black poiesis, as Ronald Judy might say. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And the question is in alignment, I think, with one of the questions in the chat about line dancing. And the question is, does the line dancing call to dance, instruct gestures, invite others to join, suggest an alternative call? And I'll use that to address your question, because one of the things that I think is that the call is not possible for Blacks. The call is an anti-Black technology of its subjectivity or its production of the subject. So in the absence of call, in the absence of calling into being or being called by being, the Black sits, I would say, in an echo chamber of a certain, what Judy would call muteness, And it is the muteness that Black nihilism is invested in understanding. How does that muteness develop itself in ways that allow Blacks to survive the violence of the human's call? And I think line dancing might be line dancing and other forms of anti-Black joy. Now, I'll call it that because very often when you see line dancing, it is as a way of expressing joy within tremendous violent conditions. It is an aesthetic of joy that Blacks deploy in response to a violent call. So Black nihilism is not invested in integrating Blackness into ontological calling. It is much more invested in the way that ontological muteness necessitates the cultivation of joy practices. And these joy practices might be called a certain Black aesthetics. So line dancing is one aesthetic, the choreography of the Black body. Black singing is an aesthetic of joy. There are many, many aesthetic practices that I think are cultivated in muteness. And when I say muteness, I don't mean that Blacks can't make a sound, but I mean in response to the chamber of being, Blackness cannot call. In fact, Black execration is precisely the impossibility and the failure of an ontological call. And I think the work of Black humanism tries to seduce us that there is technology that will allow Blacks to call just like everyone else, right? And the Black holding a cell phone is not the same as a Karen holding a cell phone, right? In fact, we can see that even as you talked about in the hearing, the judicial hearing, when Blacks are brought before the law, the cell phone evidence never is evidence of ontological integrity, right? But the Karen call is always given the benefit of the doubt, right? So there's a way, in short, that practices of Black joy, I think, are cultivated precisely in a certain abyss that these violent calls produce. And it is part of the enterprise of Black nihilism to pursue these practices and to sketch out their infrastructure.
Thanks, Calvin. That was really clarifying. I really appreciate your comments. It looks like we have some questions in the chat. So I will recite them, I guess. So this question is from Ling Tong, and she says, Calvin, thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciate how you read Heidegger against himself. How did this approach or mode of subversion arise in your work and thinking? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm sure that I'll be accused of misreading, and that's quite okay. I think part of the work of a Black intellectual is that you have to work within a violent tradition, and you have to use the tools of violence in order to try to expose and weaken that violence. And there's no, to me, outside of that violence in terms of scholarly work. So just to use language, to use to think psychoanalytically, as you wonderfully do, Linette, the father's name, the father's law, the signifier is infused with anti-Blackness. There is no way to get out of an anti-Black symbolic order. So the Black thinker, the Black poet, the Black artist must use the anti-Black tools around them in order to try to create some space to think about Black existence. So, you know, if you ask, how does that mode of subversion arise in my work and thinking, it arises out of necessity. I don't have any other choice. You know, so there's a certain complicity that is the suffering of the Black intellectual. I will always, in some sense, be complicit in the very anti-Blackness that I want to undermine, because the tools of my subversion are themselves anti-Black. I don't have any non-anti-Black tools to present. So the only thing that I can do in a Heideggerian term is to use destruction in a way that he used it. You know, so for Heidegger, he didn't believe that we can finally overcome metaphysics, but that we have to try to severely weaken it. We have to try to weaken metaphysics to instigate its self-consumption. And he would say that we might never get out of metaphysics, but maybe there's a way in which, you know, the post-metaphysicians hold out hope that we can render metaphysics inoperative. And I think in a similar way, you know, any subversion that a Black nihilist or an Afro-pessimist might introduce is a form of destruction where we know that we're not going to end an anti-Black world. We're not going to completely destroy an anti-Black violence, but we can destroy, meaning that we can severely weaken, we can denaturalize, we can demystify, we can expose the infrastructure of its violence. We can sketch out the phenomenology of this violence to show its edifice. And that's the only thing that I can do. So I think it's a subversion that is also suffering, because I wish I had a pure alternative outside of anti-Blackness in order to wage my assault on anti-Blackness, but I don't. The only thing that I can think of is within that violence, there is something called the spirit. And I don't think that that spirit is completely subordinate or held captive by anti-Blackness. Perhaps it works through anti-Blackness and it is manifested as Black joy, but it is a spirit, you know, a Black joy that announces itself at the site of the subversion, even if it cannot claim to have triumphed completely over anti-Blackness. So those are just some thoughts about subversion, and subversion as always a form of Black suffering.
Actually, I have a question to that last point of it. I wanted, I'm really curious about the way in which you're putting together spirit and subversion, because I mean, maybe this question is old hat for you by now, but can you explain, or how do you conceptualize then Black nihilism? Is it, I mean, when we're thinking about something like the end of the world, then how does one think of it against the kind of eschatological, in a kind of eschatological sense? Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, this is kind of what I was touching at earlier in my question, is then destruction not a site of creation or something otherwise?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, I often think of the end of the world, and, you know, I haven't quite worked this out with precision, but I'll just suggest, you know, how the Habermasians, you know, the heirs of Kant would talk about a regulatory ideal, that we have ideals that perhaps we will never really achieve, but the point of the ideal is to regulate our existence, to regulate our behavior, to keep us in a certain posture toward that which perhaps may not ever be realized, but it is designed to keep us moving towards something. I think of the end of the world as the inverse of that. It's a regulatory de-ideal. The end of the world is not something that I think that we're going to accomplish, but it disabuses us of fantasies of overcoming in our existence. So a de-ideal regulates existence by, discrediting enterprises of accomplishment, of telos, of security. And so within a regulatory de-idealization, something like the end of the world that is a possibility, that is an impossibility, I would say that the way that Blacks survive that, the way that they endure that, is through Black joy and Black spirit. Now, I say that Black joy and Black endurance and Black spirit are subversive because within a de-idealized world, Black existence is not supposed to have any joy. Social death is supposed to have emaciated Black or rendered Black existence emaciated of any life-sustaining substance, any flesh. Black existence is supposed to be bodies without flesh. And I think that when Blacks line dance, when they sing, when they create these, TikTok culture, when they have all of these other practices and performances or aesthetics of joy, it is truly subversive to a de-idealized world which mandates that Black existence is just bare-boned suffering. So my Black nihilism is not necessarily an Afro-pessimism, maybe. Maybe it is or maybe it's not. I believe that Black existence has practices of joy and affirmation that we have not yet given significant philosophical or theological attention to, but they hold the secrets of Black subversion as Black endurance. Right? So in short, I would say Black nihilism wants to think through the way that the call produces a world of such tremendous violence that we would think the triumph of this world is the complete emaciation of Black existence. But what we're finding is that despite that emaciation, there is meat on the bone, as my grandmother might say. And you discover, you thought that you have eaten that bone so thoroughly. You thought that anti-Blackness has eaten all of the meat off of that bone until there's nothing left, but aha, there is a piece of meat that persists nonetheless. And this is to say that this piece of meat does not destroy the anti-Blackness eating. It is just to say that it is a persistence that is subversive in its persistence. And I don't read that persistence through Black optimism and its naive, aspirations, but I do read that persistence as subversion to the extent that the grammar of political optimism doesn't capture what that persistence is. And so that's why it's truly subversive to me.
Thanks, Calvin. That was very generative. We have a question actually from Andrew, and he asks, would you distinguish this from fugitivity, e.g. Snorton's definition of capacity, quote unquote, capacity under captivity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I shy away from the grammar of capacity because capacity, and I think Frank Wilderson has done such a marvelous job of, decimating capacity as a universal term that I'm not going to rehearse it there. I would just lead you to Red, White, and Black, his book on Afro-pessimism, where he really provides, I think, a severe critique of capacity as not a universal resource. And it is a resource that relies on the non-capacity of Blackness to sustain itself. So I think I get what he means by capacity under captivity, or what they mean, by capacity under captivity, excuse me. but I would, rather than relying on the term capacity, say that it is a mystery under captivity. It is a certain mystery because it is not accounted for within the grammar that we have at our disposal. And it is a mystery that I think Black nihilism presents as a certain mysticism. And I use mysticism, mystery under captivity, mysticism under captivity. It is something under captivity that captivity has not fully cannibalized or fully, has not fully eaten up, but it is something that resists, well, and let me not use the term resist. It is something that remains despite the cannibalism, the cannibalization of anti-Blackness. So how it remains, how it persists, how it endures is a mystery. We don't quite have a grammar to explain it. And I think that that is part of the task of Black nihilism, is not only to disabuse ourselves of all of the metaphysical fantasies that we are addicted to in order to survive, but to say that there is a mystery, a resource, a mysterious resource that Blacks have had to endure from the hold of the ship, until now, that have allowed us to survive and endure. And so what might that be? I think that that is part of the task. So I think in alignment with Snorton, I would say that there is something under capacity that I will not put under the heading of capacity, but I will put under the heading of something mysterious.
We have a question from Andrew Moses, and he asks, I'm curious about the temporality of the call versus muteness, time versus X time. But what about in relation to futurity? What is the temporal difference between the call / guardianship and prophecy?
Yeah, that's a very great question. I had written an essay some years ago about Black time, and I talked about that, going back to capacity, one of the brilliant arguments that Frank introduces is that Blacks do not have the privilege of time-space capacity in the way that human subjects do. And I had written an article called Black Time, in which I had said that Blacks do not have that capacity. They exist in a time without duration. It's a time that cannot be mapped onto past, present, or future. It's a temporal terrorism that blends or renders these temporal distinctions indistinct. And so if we think of prophecy as a particular calling into the present of something that is located in the future, I would say I say this with hesitance, I would say with and kind of against Cornell's work on the prophetic, that, a certain practice of Black joy and Black existence relies on a certain prophetic calling that I would argue is not enslaved or subordinate to futurity, right? So if we think of prophecy as being the substance of the future, I think we limit our understanding of the Black prophetic in particular. And I think the Black prophetic is something more than calling into the present what has been envisioned into the future. I think the Black prophetic is precisely the mystery of practices of joy as we are experiencing them. And we do not have to subordinate those practices to a temporal narrative of linearity, even a temporal narrative of a spiraling, Afrofuturism might want to do that. And I'm very sympathetic to Afrofuturism. So what I think Black nihilism wants to do is it wants to release the Black prophetic from captivity by the future. And to say that because the future has never been the property of Blacks, when we say that there's no future for Blacks, we're meaning that Blacks do not share in the futural as a privilege of existence, that Dasein, as its being might share, that its project is always oriented in time toward the future. This is why Blacks might be called non-ontological, because it cannot share in that temporal fantasy of the future. Just getting from day to day is an issue. Mind what might happen 10 years from now. So in short, what I would say, hopefully to provide some clarity or precision to what I'm saying, is that muteness as a form of prophecy, or muteness as Black prophetic in action, is not tethered or restricted to the futural. The futural is a racial privilege that Blackness does not, I think, have as a resource, and its prophecy thus cannot be restricted to that fantasy of the future. I think you're muted, Linette. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if you want to chime in and answer any of these, please feel free.
I mean, no, I'm really just kind of chewing on. No, I'm just kind of chewing on these really kind of gems you're providing us, Calvin. Yeah, I mean, I think the way in which you're thinking about the futurity as a kind of racial privilege, yeah, that's quite striking in the sense that I think for me, it also resonates the way in which in your presentation today, I mean, through the instance of the Karen call, the Karen call scaffolds the categories or brackets the categories of, or the particularities of race, sexuality, and gender. And I say the category of race as well, insofar as, I think what your job or your presentation did achieve is it shows how these semantic or syntactical particularities ramify Blackness into the real. And even the category of race, I think, endorses that in an implicit way. And so for you raising this notion of futurity as a racial privilege, the way that I am in hearing you say that is, it's a racial privilege, but also one that's undercut by anti-Blackness, or one that is outside of, or follows the kind of e-logics of anti-Blackness. But we have, we have one more question in the chat. But yeah, everything that you shared with us today, Calvin, was very, very generative, and I hope you publish that piece on Black Time. I think will make serious interventions at the intersections of Black critical theories, political theology, and psychoanalysis. There's a question here that I think you answered a little bit, but I think it's from Allison Smith. She asks, do we lose the specificity and subsequent accountability of the individual Karens through the archetype of Karen? Or does the archetype allow us to see the ontological framework more clearly?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and this I can say that, that there are problems in it. It does beg for a certain, Heidegger text does beg for a certain feminist reading that I think that, Avital really brilliantly does, and others have as well. but the position of the mother in Heidegger is kind of an archetype. You know, it is a position rather than an identity. And the position has a function. And the function of this particular position that we might call the mother that is to prepare the child to hear the call of being. And I think of Karen, I read, you know, as I was reading some of Heidegger, I was trying to say, well, what if I replace the word mother with Karen? So, you know, like what if we reread like Being in Time, or reread what is it to think, or whatever. We read these Heideggerian texts, and whenever we see the word mother, we replace it with Karen. Would that elucidate the condition that we're in and help us to understand why Karens are so attentive to, or so insistent on calling? Because a lot of the mother's function in Heidegger is predicated around the call. So is the position of the mother one that is necessary for any call? And so that is why I don't know if I want to think of a Karen as a particular identity with specificity, although, you know, I know that there are problems in reducing, you know, evacuating, you know, a person of their specificity and calling them an archetype. So I accept all of that, you know, violence, but I would say, you know, in this violent reading of presenting this Karen as an archetype, you know, I would say yes to your question, that I think it allows us to see the ontological framework more clearly, because it allows us to see Karen not just as a particular individual identity that we can dismiss as irrational, but to begin to think of the Karen as an indispensable position within an ontological structure. And this indispensable condition is that she prepares one to hear the call. She prepares Dasein. She prepares the young boy for Heidegger. But I would say the other part of that is that she also polices and surveils and regulates through the use of technology to make sure that the call that she has prepared the child to receive is also a call that regulates an encroachment from what should not belong. So I think you're absolutely right to ask that question. And I think the particular reading that I present here is one of structural position and not necessarily individual identities.
I just want to come on and say what a genuine pleasure it was, especially with Calvin's quite incisive remarks and Linette's very searching response and additional questions that I think really lives up to Heidegger, who would say that perhaps this event itself might remind us that we've only just started thinking, or we haven't even thought before. So let's all join in thanking, as an audience, our two great presenters this evening, and note that WHAP next year, in the new year, is going to be led by our Dean, Amanda Beach, who's staging a series of dialogues. So stay tuned more for that information, but this concludes out the Blackout series, and I couldn't imagine a better way to do it. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Linette, for brilliant, beautiful comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Calvin.